Hi, everybody, and welcome to your last YouTube lecture on essential new learning for the 2019-2020 school year. The purpose of this lecture is basically going to be to kind of wrap up as best we can from the essential new learning we've been doing, both Latin America and Europe, and kind of just give you ideas of what happened near the end, where things went, et cetera, and exactly some of the issues kind of facing both continents as we go forward today. So we're going to start in Latin America. The thing on this says Latin America from the 80s to present. You can see Hugo Chavez with a couple of pistols at a press conference there. I just found that picture fascinating and emblematic. So much going on. And sadly, thanks to so much that happened in the 70s and 80s with Operation Condor, the theme of this one is really kind of no place to go but up. Now, let's start here by looking at the thesis that I'm basically going to be arguing to you today during this time, which is that realizing the problems with Operation Condor, like dictators, death squads, dirty wars, et cetera, Latin Americans tried to reassert their authority, which actually led to U.S.-backed regimes only trying to squash it more. This was because those regimes that were kind of tied to the U.S. Still at the very end involved like kind of anti-communism stuff, and it took till the very end of the Cold War for that to fall apart. And originally in the 80s or stuff, that involved kind of lining their pockets with drug money while the United States looked the other way. But with the fall of the Cold War and the collapse of that, it led to a wave of neoliberal free market thinking. That has been met with mixed results. Things have looked better, for example, in Argentina and Chile. They have looked very different in Venezuela, or they have been a very complicated mess in Brazil, leaving Latin America in kind of an enigmatic place today. That has a lot of potential to be a kind of like economic leader going forward, but may or may not realize that potential depending on where the social implications of stuff are at the end of that. Now, before we get into the actual history part behind this, I want to give you guys this because this is kind of the vein through which like Latin America since about the 1980s has been viewed, and it's something called open veins in Latin America. I actually didn't even mean to pun that when I said vein earlier, but hey, that happens when you're talking like this. And I can actually sum it up. Although this book is way more important to this, than this. There is this great scene in the most recent, or not the most recent, in like a couple Bonds ago, I think it's Quantum of Solace, where James Bond is sitting there talking to his CIA contact, and they're down in Latin America and South America, and Bond looks around and he goes, "Wow, you guys have really done a number on this place. You guys, meaning the United States. This place would be nothing without Coke and communism." And the CIA operative turns around and just looks at him and says, "That's really rich coming from a Brit." And that's really kind of what open veins in Latin America is argued, and what really has been the way that a number of political scientists, as well as government officials, as well as kind of think tank people since then, have kind of viewed Latin America in its response, which 1980, which goes back to this book, and it was a book written by Galeano, who's a Uruguayan journalist that basically deals with 500 years of exploitation on the continent. Actually, when Hugo Chavez met Barack Obama for the first time, this is actually what he gave him as a present in a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing. It really kind of continues the Our America theme that had gone on through much of Latin America, and it had a massive effect both on working class Latin Americans as well as intellectuals in Europe and the United States at that point, as kind of a way of saying, okay, maybe we should dial this back. Maybe we had some major problems. Maybe Operation Condor wasn't a success. And so I bring this up at the beginning as a way to kind of view the situation, the socio-political situation in Latin America is kind of through this idea of, it's been 500 years of European and U.S. political domination and exploitation on the continent, and that needs to stop. Okay, so with that in mind, the first thing we actually need to address in talking about kind of U.S. Latin American relations from about the 80s on actually involves the drug trade. What would become horribly in the United States known as the war on drugs, thanks to the DARE movement of the 1980s and the Reagan administration and Nixon's attempt to squash that. But what we'll just kind of call the drug trade and stuff like this. And it's important because it actually begins further back. It begins with the counterculture movement that you guys will talk a ton about, and the hippie movement of the 1960s in the United States that brings drugs to the forefront of American culture, right? And this begins kind of simply with marijuana and stuff along those lines. And it's going to hit its real height in kind of the 1980s and then kind of continue on with the cocaine trade, right? By the mid 1970s, there is a huge business in Latin America of smuggling drugs to the United States. Part of this is because Latin American law enforcement, as one person says, is a little more entrepreneurial. They can be bribed a little bit easier. Americans have money to spend. It is not lost on these people that it usually tends to be upper middle class Americans, usually the people that have passed laws, like senators' sons, stuff like that, or daughters, that might have exploited Latin Americans, that might, for example, get hooked on drugs or have problems like that, so they have money to spend. So part of it is getting even with the U.S. and kind of a soft power thing. But once the upper middle class segment of American society starts to bring drugs more to the forefront of it, it becomes a big political deal at that point as well, right? Um, and by 1975, a dude by the name of Pablo Escobar, I'll show you pictures of him. The stats on him are kind of amazing. A dude by the name of Pablo Escobar, you probably heard of him before, has founded the Medellin cartel. And at the height of this power, Escobar is worth about $30 billion. The supposed stat is that he had to spend like $1,000 a month just on rubber bands in order to keep like all his money in rubber bands, et cetera, et cetera. But aside from just being like a pop culture thing that popped up, this is a really important kind of step in not only relations but also the social part, because Escobar tries, and that's why it says "That Is Not Snow." I've had a couple sophomore projects titled that before, and so it was a nod to them. But Escobar tried really hard, and this is what those projects have argued, to cultivate a Robin Hood persona. He gave back to the local community. He built parks, he built sports stadiums, etc., etc. Now, at the same time, he also broke out of jail. He tried to kill he tried to bribe judges. He killed a number of people in law enforcement, etc., etc. So I'm not saying that what he did was necessarily a good thing by any means, but it set up a different kind of idea. And what Pablo Escobar really put forward at the end, and you can see Escobar there on the left, and then Escobar in front of the White House when he was actually wanted in the United States. Now, they couldn't just arrest him at that point, but that still is a fairly gutsy move. And you can see Escobar's kind of piles of money down there after he was eventually shot and killed. But what Escobar really did was he solidified the idea that like a career in drugs was actually like possible and somewhat popular. And that has led to a number of different issues. That has led to a large part of the and then Central American and Mexican drug wars that have occurred with over the last 8 to 10 years that have left thousands and thousands of people have dead, that have caused like tons of people to flee from their homes. All of that is because people saw the Medellin cartel and stuff like that make tons of money, and Escobar do very well. On the other hand, it has also led to continued kind of you know amongst particularly certain segments of the Latin American population, continued way of saying hey, this is okay. They're just kind of giving drugs to the rich Americans, and what do we really care about them that much anyway? So we're not gonna look on it. I'm not saying that's a fairly common move at this point anymore, but it definitely was an idea that was put forward, and definitely a cultural soft power thing that's worth kind of noting in here. Aside from just Escobar and the war on drugs there, and kind of covert operations and stuff like that, it gets even more direct and even more straightforward with a dude by the name of Manuel Noriega, who was actually a military dictator of Panama. If you've forgotten, the United States had a vested interest in Panama. It had a canal there until 1999, and it still thinks that it's got a lot of importance there and stuff like that. And Noriega, if you can imagine this, was a former U.S. Trained CIA employee during Operation Condor and the Dirty Wars. We've now got a history of doing this, training people that will then kind of bite us in the butt a little bit later. In our most recent one of our more recent lectures, we talked about how much of the Taliban was trained by the United States to fight the Soviets. So anyway, Noriega, same type of thing, former U.S. and CIA employee. Who, in order to combat communism, had taken over kind of military dictatorship of Panama. And now at this point, now that the Cold War is over, he's actually a very key member of the Medellin cartel. Creating the world's so-called first narco-kleptocracy. You can imagine that, where you use drug money to basically steal and create a state based around that. I just think that's a fascinating word. And you can see kind of the intervention and the interaction and stuff like that, because eventually once Noriega is no longer kind of needed, the communism's there, the Cold War is starting to end and stuff like that. The United States invades the country in 1989, and it removes Noriega from power. Um, flip it over right here so you can see actual pictures of that. So if you can imagine this, regardless of like thought situation, et cetera, you have the United States and the DEA going into a sovereign country and arresting its leader, right? And then flying him back to the United States and prosecuting him as a drug lord. And he spent like years, like 20, 25 years in prison in the United States, and then he was sent back to Panama where he spent years and died fairly recently and stuff like that. But the reason I bring this up is, aside from like showing the impact of the war on drugs and what happened and stuff like that, it also gives you an idea of like continued U.S. intervention in Latin America. And the United States continues under Presidents Clinton and both Bushes to intervene in Latin America at kind of an alarming rate. The severity of the interventions falls significantly, but they still continue a decent amount. I'm not gonna stop and read every part of this to you right here, but this starts at Eisenhower and goes all the way to Obama. So you're looking at a variety. I mean, Democrats and Republicans, right? Like, roughly like there are 11 presidents, like five of whom are Democrats, six of whom are Republicans. So like an even split here. All of whom, when choosing to leave Latin America alone to its own devices to operate multilaterally within the Organization of American States, or to operate unilaterally and to intervene in some way, have increasingly chose to intervene. And this is one of the things that leads to kind of the United States' reputation amongst Latin Americans, which is not the greatest thing in the world. Not necessarily what I always hear when I travel is, oh, we don't hate Americans, we just hate the American government, right? Stuff like that. But also kind of really impacts like the social standing and the soft power part of this, because you have on a number of times legally elected governments that are taken down by the United States because it affects their interests. And like, if that's not the opposite of like popular sovereignty, I'm not entirely sure what is. Now, not all the interventions and stuff like that in the 80s and 90s led to like negative issues. The most famous positive thing was what was originally called NAFTA, and is now called the USMCA or the new NAFTA, depending on your point of view, your politics, et cetera, et cetera. But in 1990, the United States, Canada, and Mexico sat down to discuss the idea of creating a free trade zone in the North American continent, right? It would eliminate tariffs, and it actually currently represents one-fifth of the world's GDP exists within the North American continent in the free trade zone. And after a lot of debate, it's actually really interesting. Clinton and his presidency gets a lot of credit for it, but to be honest, the person who did a lot of the negotiation on it, et cetera, was under the Bush presidency before that, and stuff like that. But it comes into effect and goes into fruition January of 1994. Now, meanwhile, at the same time, the United States is actually starting under Clinton and then Bush two and then Obama to use the Organization of American States as for what it was intended for. It's going to establish a court on human rights, et cetera, for the Americas. They're going to actually establish a thing to intervene and how countries will intervene if a coup occurs and who gets to lead it and how it's led. And it's not always the United States anymore. They're going to normalize relations with Cuba, bring them back into the OAS, and try to create a free trade zone within all the Americas. That still hasn't happened yet. And to be honest, with kind of the rising tide of protectionism in the Trump presidency, it's not going to happen as long as that's the vibe and that's kind of in power here. But all this does represent the beginning of the end of like complete and total U.S. hegemony in the region. Now, I can't talk about this without mentioning, though, that like all this was brought back up during the 2016 election when Trump decided that he was going to campaign on the idea of tearing up NAFTA. And a lot of this was based in and around fear mongering, nationalist fear mongering, and protectionism, with almost every swath of economics of mainstream economists opposed to it, and saying that this isn't going to bring back jobs, this isn't going to do anything, et cetera, et cetera. But it rallied people up, and people who found themselves in a worse economic situation were intrigued by that. In the end, an actual new agreement was negotiated, though nothing like the tearing up NAFTA he wanted. This was basically based in and around like updating obsolete technology, et cetera, et cetera. Like what are we doing in intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. So like it's still kind of a work in progress. And if you hear about it, you'll hear about it as new NAFTA or the USMCA. There, we'll take a quick interlude with Bill Clinton there, mainly because I needed to show you pictures of something, and I found the picture of him playing the saxophone and him with his cat there to be more comical than most other ones I could find. Just remember, children, he didn't inhale. Okay. The end result of all of this, the end result of the drug issues, the end result of interventions of lack thereof, of NAFTA, et cetera, has led to an overthrow of most of the Latin American dictatorships, with the exception of Cuba, by the end of the late '80s, early '90s. The general idea is that both ideologies, both like kind of extreme like dictatorships of the right wing military, as well as like communism, again with the exception of Cuba, has failed. And what that led was to basically like two types of ideologies. The most popular one is neoliberalism, which is the idea of competition, free trade, basically return to capitalist theory, get rid of we talked about in Mexico, like how they nationalized like the oil companies, et cetera, where you're going to get rid of that nationalization, you're going to privatize it. The idea is it'll make everybody richer, et cetera, in an attempt to break the cycle of poverty for the lowest classes. It doesn't overly work well. What it does do is it does stem some debt crises and stuff along those lines, but it doesn't actually bring on real change massively, mainly because of kind of continued corruption, as well as like kind of systemic um, not only systemic kind of racial issues involving natives, et cetera, but also like systemic cultural issues like these people have always owned tons of land, and the church is important to this, and we can't do this, and we've got large things that we brought up in the honor system, the machismo culture, et cetera, right? Um, there was another option that was put forward by a man by the name of Hugo Chavez, who I showed you a picture of at the beginning, and I'll show you some more pictures of in a second here. That he called neo-Bolivarianism, sometimes just called Bolivarianism. That's why the neo is kind of in quotes up there. And he supposed that he was going to put forward ideas of Simon Bolivar into like kind of modern 21st century Latin America. Okay, yes. So this is Hugo Chavez right here. My personal favorite is Chavez in the red hat with the red-headed parrot that also looks like he has a red hat on. Um, but either way, as you're looking at Chavez, keep in mind that this is a government-based in and around like anti-imperialism, right? Like that's why he called it neo-Bolivarianism, sometimes just called, as I said, Bolivarianism, right? And its height, like for example, it did everything it possibly could to basically kind of like needle and get rid of what it called like the American and European imperialists that had dominated Latin America. This is why the open veins like lens is such a good thing to like view it through. At one point, he even got to the point that he moved the time zone by 30 minutes in Caracas, just so it wouldn't be a slave to the U.S. and British interests. Blah 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 blah. It had strong elements of Marxism to it, like it bought into ideas of like socialism for the people, and vacillated between a republic and a dictatorship under Chavez. But basically, what would happen is Venezuela in Chavez could do okay economically when oil was needed and oil was high and stuff like that. And then the minute the oil dries up, the kind of Marxism, neo-Bolivarianism economic policies would fail miserably. And in order to ignore that failing, Chavez would just direct like rhetoric and animosity against like anti-imperialism, et cetera, and like drum that up. The end result is that like by the time he died in 2013, neo-Bolivarianism had failed miserably. Venezuela was a complete tailspin. And for those of you that follow the news, you may or may not have heard today that, it's still going. His president, or his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, has succeeded him, and has led to borderline um, borderline civil war and almost insurrection with his like civilian counterpart, or sorry, legislative counterpart Juan Guaido, and Venezuela is a complete mess. As I said, bordered on like civil war slash insurrection, last coup earlier on this year. And the answer to that is there's not an overly good one. Soft power, for example, seems to be at an all-time high. Pope Francis, the Argentinian Jorge Bergoglio that we brought up earlier, was the first American elected pope from North or South America. When he was elected in 2013. Brazil has hosted a number of things recently within the last 10 years, from the World Cup to the Olympics, et cetera, et cetera. Under the Obama administration and stuff like that, Cuban-U.S. relations softened, as did Mexican-American relations, et cetera, et cetera. But still, like drugs and the gang violence related to them, and the economies and the cycle of poverty that it leads to, are still like massive problems in Latin America. And this has led to increased animosity directed towards Latin America by U.S. politicians. Trump has led a number of racist attacks on on generally Mexicans, but he would probably throw it to all Latin Americans, et cetera, et cetera. I can't claim that though, but generally that. But also like immigrants and other people that have come from Latin America to the United States. I mean, calling them things like bad hombres, saying why do all the like rapists, et cetera, come over here? And these are things that are not going to like help the social and cultural relationships between those areas, et cetera, et cetera. Free trade might be on the horizon. It might not. It kind of seems like for every step forward or two steps forward, there's about a step back taken. I'll leave you with kind of this last example. Brazil had tons of popularity, tons of soft power, et cetera, until Lulu, its president, was brought down on fabricated corruption charges. And now it's run by a populist strongman by the name of Javier Bolsonaro, who you may or may not heard of before. Bolsonaro has made the news recently for doing things like saying COVID-19 is no worse than a cold, mocking people for wearing masks, and Brazil is currently watching the COVID death rate absolutely skyrocket. As recently as last week, like early June 2020, the New York Times was reporting that the country could literally be on the brink of a coup, with Bolsonaro's son actually saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So, like, where do things go from here exactly? We're not entirely sure. A lot of things are going to have to see where it comes out at, like, the end of COVID and stuff like that. But, like, Latin America, like, seems to need to figure out a way to basically still do exactly what Marty was saying years ago, which is break out of the mold of Europe and North America, et cetera, and find out a way to like take its own political and economic place in the world, if that makes sense. And that seems to be something it's still working on here. Okay, guys, this concludes like what I'm going to talk about Latin America. The rest of the thing will be kind of on the Yugoslav wars, closing out Europe, et cetera, et cetera. I put them together in case you wanted to watch them all at one time, but if you want to take a break and do one Tuesday and one Wednesday, now's the perfect time and perfect place to call it. For the rest of you, we'll start talking about the Yugoslav wars in about 2 or 3 seconds here. Okay, having talked about Latin America for a bit here and kind of wrapped up stuff as best we could in an essential new learning fashion, I'm now going to try to do the same thing with Europe here. This might take a little bit longer, but I'll do my best to get us through this in kind of a timely fashion. Now, if you remember, when we started the 20th century at the time, I showed you a picture of the Goat Bridge in Sarajevo, and I said the 20th century in Europe begins and ends in the most unlikely of all places, and that is Sarajevo. And we're back in Sarajevo now. That's what that sign says. Welcome to Sarajevo. This lecture is usually entitled The Return of History and the End of Dreams, because basically there was a book written in 2008 arguing that during this time things could have been great. At the end of the Cold War, we could have made everything, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed like a almost ideologically beautiful time, and instead Europe and the rest of the world retreated back to what it had always known, which is kind of bickering and fighting each other, et cetera, et cetera. And that's essentially what I'm going to be arguing you today. Is essentially is that, like following the end of the Cold War, Europe and much of the rest of the world seem to be entering an unprecedented world of peace and cooperation, affirmed by institutions like NATO, the UN, the EU, et cetera, et cetera. And some of those, like the EU, actually were surprisingly successful. Others, like NATO and the United Nations, did not do very much to stop the cultural clashes and splintering and fracturing of Europe. And the end result is, and not quite fracturing of Europe, I should note, because it's not war, it's not broken up, it's just a very tense peace, if that makes sense. It's an unprecedented 70-year peace, right? That was welcomed by many people. But they feel that it could kind of be threatened at any time, right? And so over the last, since the end of the Cold War, Europe's leaders have worked tirelessly to prevent that peace from being threatened, while also confronting their increasing irrelevance on the stage of world politics, as Asia and places like that have taken a more and more increased role in world politics. Okay, so when we last left off in Europe, I had you guys watch some stuff on the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm still lamenting the fact I didn't get to show you the video that I normally show in class. I tried like crazy to find it. It's probably one of my favorite videos of the year, just because of the amazingly bad writing and the amazingly horrible fashion and some really comical points in it. But regardless, what you realize is that in November, and that would have been the last date that I would have had you memorize in European history, November 9th, 1989. I won't make you do that, though, since you can look up whatever you want at this point and stuff like that. But the Berlin Wall falls, okay? And that is usually seen as the beginning of the end of the Cold War, okay? A number of other communist bloc countries hold free and fair elections very, very, very soon. Um, and here, I'll actually take a second and show you that real quick. You can kind of see right there, you've got some pictures of the Berlin Wall on the top right there. And all of this is done by Mikhail Gorbachev up here. Gorbachev had instituted, or not done, but kind of allowed by Mikhail Gorbachev. In the 80s in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev had instituted a number of policies called Glasnost and Perestroika. And these had allowed for openness and economic freedom. Okay, and remember, Gorbachev's the one on the top left with the birthmark. And what that eventually did was kind of led to an eroding of the Iron Curtain, if that makes sense, which was then culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall and free and fair elections. Right? You'll talk a ton more about Glasnost and Perestroika later on in your like stuff next year, because like that really is kind of seeing that, and then some moves that Reagan did as kind of the end of the Cold War here. Okay, now. That's the stuff that you're going to either read about or have read about, depending on where you are, if you did the reading first or watched first, the Glasnost and Perestroika stuff. Now, with that, though, free and fair elections had occurred in certain places. You can see Lech Walesa on the bottom down there, led on the bottom left. You see Václav Havel on the bottom right. Most places have gone really smoothly. As a matter of fact, the Czechoslovakian stuff that eventually led to a split between the Czech Republic and the People's Republic of Slovakia, they basically looked at each other and said, you know, we don't like you guys very much. And they were like, yeah, we never liked you very much. And we were kind of put together randomly, so let's just go our separate ways. And on January 1st, 1993, they did. That actually got the nickname the Velvet Revolution because of how smoothly it went. Right? So, as corny as that is, don't worry, you got lots of other corny things. You've got the singing revolution and stuff like this during this time. Okay, so with the Eastern Bloc like kind of falling apart from like November of '89 on and kind of slowly going through there, the Soviet Union begins to go into its tailspin by 1990 and 1991. And though the falling apart of the Soviet Union is fairly bloodless, with the exception of about 20-25 deaths in Lithuania, which starts the rebellion, something they're very proud of, the rest of it kind of disintegrates over the course of the thing. And I believe the official date of like the end of the Soviet Union is December 26th, 1991, somewhere in there. Though some parts of it, like Belarus, hang around like in kind of like a soft power, like cultural influence way, and other places like some of your Central Asian republics like Turkmenistan hang around a little bit longer. Mikhail Gorbachev is incredibly unpopular from Glasnost and Perestroika, and in August of '91, a coup of hardliners try to overthrow him. But Gorbachev wins the coup, but because he has communist sympathies, they replace him at his consent. He goes into retirement. He's actually still alive, with a man by the name of Boris Yeltsin, who's a former communist turned like socialist who like can kind of be kind of a bridge gap thing, if that makes sense. And Russia's economy goes into a tailspin hardcore. My parents were in Russia after this time, and they'd asked me what I wanted, and I said, bring me back a ruble. I'm curious what it looks like. And my mom told me that apparently it was like pulling teeth trying to get a ruble in Russia at any time, because they were all using dollars and nobody wanted them. She asked for change in rubles a couple times, and finally some guy was finally like, look lady, I'm going to give you your change in dollars, and then you can take this one ruble, which is absolutely worthless, back to your son in the United States, who can enjoy this type of thing, right? Or for whatever reason. Um, Anyway, Yeltsin wins a second coup. Okay, in 1993, there is an attempt to completely restore the Soviet Union with like the military, a faction of the military. That's put down. The Supreme Soviet is disestablished. Any former hanging around like republics, Belarus, etc., are absolutely gone. And rule by Duma returns. Eventually, Yeltsin is going to be succeeded by Vladimir Putin, who's succeeded by Dmitry Medvedev, who's then succeeded by Putin yet again. And supposedly this leads to a thawing of U.S. Russian relations. And here are the U.S. presidents during that time enjoying their Russian counterparts. As you can see, relations, or at least the status of relations, is meant to have thawed significantly more. You got Clinton and Yeltsin in the upper left-hand corner laughing about something. God only knows what the two of them could find funny together. And then you've got a very jovial Vladimir Putin talking to the second President Bush. And so, like, part of the whole, like, MO behind this was a, like, kind of, and that's why I said the return of history and the end of dreams, at least for a little bit, was a, like, supposed supposedly like warming of relations between the United States and Russia, etc., etc. Okay, now as I said earlier, the bulk of the Eastern Bloc breaks up mostly peacefully. Some of it breaks up, as we talked about in Czechoslovakia. Others of it unites, as we talked about with Germany. But regardless, it kind of politically sorts its kind of lines on the map out peacefully for the most part. The one exception being Romania, which I'll talk about in a second. And the bulk of the Eastern European economies also completely and totally collapsed too right after this. The one exception being the GDR or Eastern Germany, mainly because West Germany is able to like kind of absorb the GDR, and so like it doesn't fall apart as much. They just kind of like have a crummy German economy for 5 years and then get it back together and get it going and stuff along those lines. It would have fallen apart too, right? But the ones that introduce capitalism severely. So basically, what I mean by that is overnight they're just kind of like, okay, and starting on like Tuesday, you have complete free enterprise and stuff like that. Leads to major problems at first, particularly amongst the older generation who has no idea what to do. Leads to major entrepreneurial success amongst the younger generation, and those countries tend to be by far the most successful in the end. The ones that are most famous for doing that are Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, though a few other places do it. But to give you an idea, at the fall of communism, the GDP of Poland and the GDP per capita, of Poland and Ukraine is roughly the same at about like 25,000 or so. And 20 years after that, the GDP of Poland per capita is double that of the Ukraine, right? To give you an idea, or sorry, double that of Ukraine, to give you an idea. It became Ukraine after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. When it was in the Soviet Union, it was called the Ukraine. So at that point, it's just Ukraine. So anyway, it's double that of Ukraine. I just misspoke and wanted to correct myself. To give you the kind of massive idea of what I'm talking about here. And how much the kind of shock therapy thing kind of worked and changed. Now, as I said, there is some minor violence and executions in Romania and some old Soviet republics, and by that I mean places in Central Asia that fell apart, like Turkmenistan, etc., etc. Belarus, for example, even Europe, doesn't have the best like transition to power. It's still run by a despot and has been run by a despot, Lukashenko, for an extended period of time. But the one old Soviet bloc, or sorry, the one old Eastern Bloc country to really experience some violence is Romania, because Romania had been run by a dude by the name of Nicolae Ceausescu, who had basically been skimming off the state like crazy. His wife had like thousands of dresses, and they ate like and lived lavishly while people were in poverty and stuff like that. And so while trying to run away, he's caught by the Romanian army, and he and his wife were actually shot on television after a summary trial on Christmas Day, 1989. For those of you that really enjoy YouTubing that thing, feel free to. You can find a video of it if you really want to. Now, having said all that, the one state that completely falls apart is the one that was not propped up by the Iron Curtain, the one that had been led, that had tried to be like, not part of the Eastern Bloc, was specifically non-aligned, and that is Yugoslavia. And that breaks into complete and total civil war. Now, in case you'd forgotten the background I was talking about on the last slide here, this is a map right here. And everything that's in a different color that's not that kind of drab thing, that is what was Yugoslavia, okay? It's now 7 different countries today: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, purposely labeled that way so that Greece doesn't get upset, because yeah, if it were Macedonia, they'd get really upset about that. It's now North Macedonia, I believe, is what they've finally settled on. That's another story for another time. Feel free to look that up on your own time, Greece and Macedon's use of naming. Anyway, this area was Yugoslavia, okay? And despite the fact, if you remember, after World War II, it had been kind of retaken over in World War II with the help of a dude by the name of Marshal Tito and his partisans, right? And while Tito was a communist, he was not a Stalinist, right? And he never joined Stalin. He never was part of the Warsaw Pact. He never was part of the Eastern Bloc. He and Stalin actually had a number of fights and stuff like that. Stalin tried to assassinate him a few times. Tito sent him a letter once that said, please stop trying to kill me, because if you don't stop trying to kill me, I will do that to you and I will not have to try, stuff along those lines. They did not get along at all, okay? So while it was technically communist, it was not part of the Eastern Bloc. That's what I was trying to get at. But this is what was Yugoslavia. I'll bring this map back up for you to see in a second after I talk for a second. Now, as you can see from the like last thing, that country is massively ethnically diverse, right? And it had, if you remember, just been thrown together. Yugoslavia means land of the South Slavs, right? And it was thrown together after World War One. But the problem is that over the course of most of the 20th century, right, all sorts of people in those various ethnic groups, Serbs, Croats, etc., had intermarried, and they'd moved and they'd settled around and they'd gotten together and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons that Tito is able to hold this together and be popular is because he's, oh god, I'm going to mess this up, but one of his parents, I think it was his mother was Croatian and his father was Slovenian, and then he lived in Belgrade. I know that last part's there, which is true, which is Serbia. But one of his parents was Slovenian, the other was Croatian, and he lived in Serbia. So he had like representation kind of all around, if that makes sense. And he's a communist dictator, but technically he's considered a benevolent dictator. As I'll show you a picture on the next slide, like the main street in Sarajevo is still named Marshal Tito Way, right? He dies in 1980, and there really is no real good acceptable leader after this. Now Tito had secured the 1984 Sarajevo Olympics, or sorry, the Winter Olympics, sorry, the 1984 Winter Olympics for the city of Sarajevo. And the country is able to kind of hang together through that with kind of the cultural like importance and stuff like that. Okay, but as that's like going on, the guy that becomes leader of this is a dude by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. Now, if you go all the way back to the beginning of this 20th century, when I said things start and stop in Sarajevo, which I mentioned earlier, I also brought up something called like Greater Serbia that came out of Serbian nationalism, and this is the idea that like there are a bunch of big powerful states, etc., and Serbia should form a big powerful state in the Balkans, in and around Serbia with its capital, and there, and the Serbian are superior, people are superior, and they should be based around Belgrade, etc. And Slobodan Milosevic uses the Olympics, that soft power and stuff like that, and then the type of like um, uh, uh, focus that he's given after that to drum up Serbian nationalism and really discriminate against kind of the rest of like of the Yugoslav people. There you can see Marshal Tito Street as well as a statue of Tito or so. That was in a museum, and then actually that's actually still in the middle of a square in Sarajevo. You can see the logo for the Sarajevo '84 Olympics. Um, and what Milosevic does is he basically begins to discriminate against anybody that's not Serbian, and say like anybody that is Serbian has a responsibility to like do a number of pro-Serbian things, and like make sure that Serbians are more important, and like be nationalistic, etc., in these places. And so it leads to people who live in like Bosnia and Herzegovina that are ethnically Serbian, drumming up Serb nationalism there, etc., not just in Serbia, etc. The end result is it drives the country apart, and he uses that driving the country apart as a pretext for war. Like, we need to start a war. We can't just let everybody get away because there are Serbians in Croatia, there are Serbians here, and they all should be together in a larger, greater Serbia kind of area. Okay. So what actually happens here? Well, Slovenia first in 1992, I think it's June of '92, declares its independence and gets away. Slovenia was one of the smaller areas of Yugoslavia. It represented, I think, about 8% of the population, but over 20% of the economic like area and force, etc. Slovenia was culturally not very close to the other parts of Yugoslavia at all, being way culturally closer to Italy and Austria, etc. On a side note, Slovenia is a gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous country. I'd highly recommend going if you ever get the chance. Ljubljana is absolutely fantastic. But Slovenia gets away and it's gone. Bam. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia try to do the same thing, and war ensues here. And now you've really got kind of almost a three-way war going, if that makes sense. And that Bosnia and Herzegovina will both fight Serbia, but they will sometimes also fight each other depending on the issue and what's going on and who's in charge and what's said and the various nationalism, etc. here. And Serbia, the other places, what will eventually break away, Montenegro, Kosovo, and what is now, as I said, North Macedonia, those areas are still kind of on their own and with Serbia, etc., trying to get away, trying not to get away, etc. Croatia can hold its own. It's got the population as well as the navy and stuff along those lines to be able to do it. and to be able to set siege and stuff like that. Sarajevo, on the other, sorry, not Sarajevo. Bosnia, on the other hand, really cannot. Bosnia doesn't have the military. It wasn't concentrated there. It didn't have any type of navy or the outer coast that it could seize like Croatia did. About 45% of Bosnia at that point is Serbian anyway, ethnically, and so they're not really fighting. They're actually kind of wanting Bosnia to become part of Serbia and side with that, etc., etc. And so the Serbian army, led by a dude by the name of Ratko Mladic, begins the siege of Sarajevo from 1992 to 1996. The city is absolutely still wrecked today. On top of that, during the war, and this is why we care about this war, and this is why I had to bring it up, and this is why this is important, the Serb and Yugoslav army begins to ethnically cleanse Bosnia. This leads to people being put in concentration camps, being systematically starved. It was a way of eliminating the Muslim population. It led to the surrounding area of Sarajevo just being kind of completely and utterly, like, as I said, sieged and dropped off and stuff like that. And a number of very notable massacres. The most famous one, the massacre at Srebrenica, where General Ratko Mladic orders the killing of 8,000 plus Bosniak women and children, and those are ethnically Muslim Bosnians at that time. And so, like, as I'll show you, and then the next things I'm going to show you is a bunch of pictures. There are some pictures that look very, very similar to stuff that happened 50 years before in concentration camps with the Nazis, and that's why I really feel the need to teach this. Is I'm not going to teach European history and not teach you that there were people being put in camps 50 years after everything that happened in World War II and that entire disaster. So as I said, the next few slides are going to be a lot of pictures. I might go through them a little bit quickly, so feel free to take some time and look at them if you need to. Just kind of pause it to kind of look at them a little bit faster than like my speeches, if they're a little bit longer than I speak on them, if that makes sense. This slide actually right here is Sarajevo when the siege first started. The pictures on everything except for the bottom left I took. That picture is Sarajevo's parliament building when it was actually attacked by the Serbian army, or the Yugoslav army as it was called at that time, and the Bosnian parliament building was literally on fire. You can see it down, kind of restored right there, and the picture right next to it. Very ironically, it was actually the government of Greece that paid the extra money for them to be able to restore their parliament building. This was before the financial crisis of 2008, but it just makes you wonder. Anyway, the other photo right there says Warning Sniper, and what you can see right there is something in Sarajevo that became known as Sniper's Alley during the time that it was under siege, and that whole like line right there in the surrounding, because that picture's taken from the hills surrounding it. Snipers would set out and just pick people off. And one of the guides I was talking about how literally, in order to make sure she survived, and the family had money, his mom had to walk, like, because you didn't have the gas and transportation and stuff like that with the city under siege. So his mom had to walk about 5 miles to work each day. It would have been only about 2 miles, but she had to go out and around Sniper Alley, so she made sure she didn't get shot, because that's where they were just kind of picking off innocent civilians. These guys right here are the three people that are generally considered by the world to be most responsible for the Yugoslav war and the atrocities in it. The dude in the middle in the tie is a dude by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. He was eventually arrested and tried for war crimes and actually died while he was in prison awaiting trial. The guy on the left is Radovan Karadzic. He was the leader of Serbians in Bosnia, who also tried to get a number of atrocities committed against non-Serbians living in Bosnia. So, like, suggested the siege of Sarajevo, suggested some of the killings of women and children and stuff like that. He actually tried to be on the run for a number of years after the Yugoslav wars ended, and when he was caught, he was masquerading as a Greek Orthodox healer and monk. And that's actually Radovan Karadzic down on the bottom after he was caught with all that hair, etc., etc. He's currently serving a lifetime sentence in jail for war crimes, as is the guy on the right playing cards. That was the man by the name of Ratko Mladic. He was the leader of the Serb army during this time, or the Yugoslav army during this time, and was personally responsible for the massacre at Srebrenica, killing at least 8,000 innocent men, women, and children, all while the UN kind of sat there and watched, but was unable to actually do anything because of kind of bureaucratic UN rules. And that's kind of what I was getting at the beginning when I said some institutions worked here and other institutions kind of failed during this time. The thing you're looking at here is something called a Sarajevo rose. You can find these all over the city of Sarajevo today. They represent every time a mortar was shot throughout the city, and then went on to kill the citizens in some way during the siege of Sarajevo. Some of them are still like red and colored. Others are like kind of been worn down and stuff like that. So I tried to give an example of one. What that means is at some point between 1992 and 1996, a mortar was fired by the Yugoslav army and killed at least one innocent civilian. Who was going about their business in Sarajevo on that spot during that war sometime in the mid 90s. So this next slide shows pictures that were taken from Reuters and international media at the time. On the left, you can see Bosniaks being led out of Sarajevo to various camps and stuff like that. You can see older men and women being led in wheelbarrows or stuff like that, being kind of forced out of their homes. Into these camps. Now, to be clear, these were not like death camps in the sense of like, Auschwitz or something like that, but they were work camps and they were places where like people were systematically like starved or given very little like or very meager rations. In the back, you can see the soldiers of the United Nations, and I hinted earlier that like from time to time during these splintering crises, the institutions failed, and this is the perfect example. Not in a like, oh, the UN couldn't do anything, but in a bureaucratic mess. Like, you know, the UN says that it can go in if the word genocide is used, but nobody's using the word genocide, and so therefore they're just peacekeeping and all this kind of BS, blah, 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 blah. And down, if you look at the bottom right, you can actually see um, better examples of people being led kind of along a railroad line. You could see men, women, children towards camps that would not be that would be shockingly similar, i.e., not that dissimilar to like the concentration camps, not the death camps, but the concentration camps of like 1941 to 1945. This is a cover of Time magazine and also a book that gives you an example of what life was like in the camps or stuff like that. I said this up here because it says 1990 or 1944, and my point is no, this is not 1944. This is 1994. This is literally 50 years after supposedly learning all these things, after supposedly never again, after supposedly all that, and we still have people being put into camps and being systematically starved. For example, take this picture right here. I could gray it out for you, right? And you would have no idea if this was Yugoslavia in 1994 or Poland in, say, 1944. That's the situation we found ourselves in. And that's what I meant when I said I absolutely refuse to not teach the Yugoslav wars and tell you guys that, yes, another genocide was committed in Europe 50 years after. And no, we didn't as a group. We collectively, we, meaning the people of Europe, etc., didn't seem to learn a damn thing from what happened in the Holocaust, or at least not much. Here are more pictures here. You can see kind of an entrance to a camp. That should look familiar. You can see the kind of grayed out thing right there. And then these two are examples of mass graves, one being like kind of dug and the other then being exhumed later. These were all taken. I just took pictures of pictures at the War Museum about this in Sarajevo. So this next one is also fairly disturbing. If you look on the bottom left, you can see some skulls that have been dug up from the ground. On the top left, you can also see people in emaciated conditions, as well as in the middle, a poster that says, "Wake up, Europe! Sarajevo calls every man, woman, and child." This was done from Sarajevo '94, so 10 years after the Winter Olympics there. On the right, you see markers of mass graves. And on the top right, you can see where it says Visegrad Genocide 92, never forget, never forgive. And so this gives you kind of an idea of the animosity at both sides were directed at each other then, as well as kind of where it currently stands today. Okay, so how's this thing end? In 1995, NATO jumps in and bombs key places in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and helps turn the tide of the war. It probably would have happened earlier, but to be honest, this is the first term of Clinton's presidency, and Clinton had won issue of interfering in, I believe it was Somalia, that had led to a huge PR disaster. And so the rest of his presidency, the rest of his first term, he's very hesitant to actually intervene. Once NATO and the Clinton administration okay this, the Serbs are defeated in about 6 weeks. Because this is something else that also frustrated a number of people I talked to in Syria. But they were like, seriously, you made us suffer for 4 years when you could have taken this whole thing down in about 6 weeks? The leaders are later arrested and charged with war crimes. As I said, most of them are in life in prison. Ladek doesn't, for example, recognize the court's jurisdiction, but it doesn't mean he's still not in prison in the Netherlands, where he will supposedly be for the rest of his life. And that International Court for the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal finally concluded in December of 2017, to give you an idea of how long this thing went on for. The place, as I've said, is now 7 different independent countries. And Serbia is just starting to take responsibility for some of its atrocities. So is Croatia, sorry, as well. Though, for every person that wants to take responsibility, you can find huge billboards as you're driving through Croatia that this man is not a war criminal, right? Stuff like that. A little bit of fighting did flare back up in the 1980s, 1998, 1999 in Kosovo, but NATO put a bit of a stop to that. And basically, the whole area is still a bit of a mess. It's still trying to get back on its feet. Croatia is in better shape. Well, Slovenia is in the best shape, but then Croatia is in slightly better shape, as is Serbia. But Bosnia, pre-pandemic, and God knows what it only is now. But pre-pandemic, Bosnia had unemployment rates of upwards of 30% and an absolutely massive brain drain still going on, with most people, young people, educated people, deciding to leave the country. So the whole area still has some major issues. This right here are some pictures from Sarajevo in the modern day. On the left, you can see one of the buildings that was shot up. As one of my guides said, he was like, every single building in Sarajevo was shot up. So you can tell which ones have been rebuilt versus which one haven't. But those are kind of bullet holes that are still left there from the war. Down in the center is actually the monument to the children, and those things that look like kind of holes in there are actually kind of children's feet, if that makes sense. And it's supposed to be a monument to the children who died during this time. And on the right is a kind of joke monument to canned beef. This was something the European Union gave to the citizens of Sarajevo to try to relieve the siege. And as one of the guys I talked to, who was about my age, maybe even about 5, 6 years younger, said growing up, he was like, if given the choice between straight up spoiled spam versus canned beef, I might choose the knowingly spoiled spam, to give you an idea here of how bad this stuff was. As you can see, large swaths of the country are still in fairly rough shape. Actually, if you go to Bosnia and Herzegovina today, one of the things that the State Department will warn you about before you go is not to go off the beaten path or anything along those lines, because you could get blown up by a landmine. Stay on the actual things, etc. Don't go off into the woods, because there are mines all over the place. And the top 2 pictures and the one with the goats are actually taken from what used to be one of the nicest restaurants in Sarajevo. And it overlooks the hill, and then what I showed you guys earlier is Sniper's Alley. And our tour guide at the time said, because there was a forest down below, and it said, this has been cleared of landmines. And he was like, I would not believe that for a second. But even then, you can see, it's still blown up. It's still shot up like crazy. And if we'd been in class, I would have brought in a bunch of shrapnel, because they're literally you could just pick it up off the floor, oh, here's a bag of shrapnel from the Yugoslav wars. On the bottom left, you can see me in something called the Tunnel of Hope. This was something that the Bosnians built throughout underneath the Sarajevo airport, and then down and out, in order to kind of break the siege. And while I'm not a very tall, I might be a very wide person, but I'm not a very tall person. And so you can see, it wasn't a very big tunnel, but this was how they got mainly supplies, etc., in and out for about 4 years, actually. And so this gives you an idea of kind of the legacy of the Yugoslav war that still exists in Bosnia and Herzegovina today. Not to completely and totally end on a horrible note, and depressing note. I wanted to talk a little bit about the European Union because I said in the thesis at the beginning, if you remember, that there were a number of institutions that didn't do very well after the Cold War and some that did. And actually, ironically, one of the interesting ones, because everybody expected it to fall on its butt miserably, one of the interesting ones that did do fairly well was the European Union. Um, and it grew out of original cooperation with the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And then it expanded to Western Europe, including France and West Germany, and then eventually to Spain after fascism, and then to Britain after Britain decided to stop being a jerk about it, and then to, other places, et cetera. First is the European Community, then the European Economic Community, then the Western European Union, then eventually the European Union from the 1990s on, where it basically expanded past what was Western Europe and into like Europe as a whole. And it became a really, really good way to actually compete with the United States in economics, or NAFTA in economics. And it actually represents the world's largest economy today and has about 720 million citizens within it. Here you can see a map of the actual European Union. It's a little bit outdated. Britain, which is in kind of light blue, should be in darker blue with Northern Ireland. Dark blue represents the countries that are not involved in the European Union. They could be kind of closely associated, like Norway or Switzerland or Iceland, or hopefully Britain will be after Brexit, or they could be in the process of joining, like Bosnia or Turkey or something along those lines, or they could just be there, kind of like Russia. But regardless, this gives you an idea of what the European Union looks like and how large it is. And one of the most mind blowing features of it is the Schengen zone, which is a completely casual approach to borders, where basically um, they've decided that everything in this is perfectly okay, and that you don't need to show your passport from time to time. So you can actually walk all the way from theoretically Lisbon in Portugal to Tallinn in Estonia without ever having to show your passport in any way whatsoever. On the right, you actually see something that I found kind of funny. I was actually in Riga in Latvia, and I was on top of a lookout tower, and I looked down, and I was like, "What the heck is that?" And I realized after looking at it, it's the European Union in the shape of a garden. You can actually even see that key things like Switzerland and Norway are left out. Um, as I said, a little outdated. Need to kind of pluck the orange out of Britain and Northern Ireland, but take another look at it, because you can look at the EU from the political map on the left or the EU garden on the right. So, what does the EU actually represent today? Well, aside from being the world's largest economy, as I said, there's a complete open borders agreement, like seamless no passport transit between a number of EU states. Not all of them, but most of them. This is known as the Schengen zone. They have international work permits. They have a rotating presidency. They literally rotate alphabetically by president. First Italy does it for 6 months, for Ireland does it for 6 months, then Italy does it for 6 months, then they move on to, I don't know what's next, IJKLK. Yeah, like Liechtenstein or something like that. Yeah, exactly. They ratify treaties, bills, etc., etc. Most famous, though, the EU is known for its single currency, the euro. Um, and that is used by basically all traditional Western nations, and is being picked up more and more by other nations. You have to meet certain economic standards in order to be able to be on the euro, but it's being picked up more and more. Now, really kind of interestingly, and you can see examples of euros up there in the top, right? And then you can see the things right there that I have, like Luxembourg and Belgium. That's all you see on the border if you're going between like these things, right? It's literally like crossing a state border, like going into Oregon. You just get a little sign that's like, and now you're in Luxembourg. That's literally all there is, right? Anyway, it looked like it was running into major problems with like Greece, and then problems spreading to Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Italy, et cetera, culminating in Brexit. But it seems to have turned out that, despite like the Brexit stuff and stuff like that, the reaction to Brexit seems to have kind of strengthened the European Union on the continent, if that makes sense. And if anything, continental Europe seems to be a little bit closer, kind of centering around like France and Germany. We That remains to be seen, like how COVID and stuff kind of impact this. But the European Union might be one of the stronger institutions going at this point. So where does that leave all us? Well, yeah, as I said, the return of history and the dreams. After the Yugoslav wars, it seemed like things were going to be going pretty well. Trade with the U.S. was up, expansion of NATO was peaceful, etc., etc. But then a number of things kind of changed that brought kind of like history back grounded into what it's always been. September 11th, was the only time that NATO's attack on one is an attack on all clause has ever been invoked. And while the response at first was helpful from everybody, it kind of decreased from Russia as time went on, right? And that led to the beginning of tensions. And then the financial crisis in 2008 led to tensions. And then you had the annexation of Crimea, or the immigration crisis, with some countries willing to take lots of immigrants and open their borders and others not. You had the rise of nationalism in Central Europe, particularly in Poland and Hungary, that has been kind of disturbing and stuff like that. Catalan independence, the Yellow Vest movement, Brexit, all these have led to kind of a series of mild splintering, and it really only kind of remains to be seen how COVID-19, the border closures, the different problems are going to impact things further. I was reading an article just recently that was talking about how Norway and Denmark have decided that they are in good shape, they can vacation together, but Sweden did a horrible job doing COVID-19, so Swedes aren't welcome in their country this summer, etc., etc. Crap like that. And what that's led people to think is that Europe is not really at risk for maybe a third world war or something like that necessarily. I hope not, at least. That's the general thinking. But they are at risk of using a lot of its perfect state status and a lot of influence to Asia, unless they can kind of utilize cooperation through the EU and other things like that. And that completely and totally remains to be seen. So that's all I got, guys. The end of European and Latin American history for now. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you all for a fantastically awesome year. I am sorry that it had to end this way. Hopefully I'll see the vast majority of you at our final Socratic seminar on Friday. All you got to do for me, assessment-wise and grading-wise and stuff like that for the rest of the year, is complete the assessment on Thursday, Friday for the whole Essential New Learning Cold War unit. You turn that in, you submit it to turnitin.com, and then we might have a survey or a video or two up for you to watch next Monday or Tuesday. So thanks for a great year, everybody, and have a fantastic summer. Enjoy.